The moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's amore. The moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's amore.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Buongiorno. I think I'm going to go ahead and start because I have to finish a little bit early for the next session. So welcome. My name is Heather Brooke, and I'm doing this session, and then also I've been curating the investigative sessions that there are throughout the festival. So there was one yesterday with Paul Radu talking about tracking assets. There's this one, which I'll be doing, which is talking about access law, how to use legislation and different laws to find out information. And tomorrow we have a group of Italian investigative journalists talking about food, who controls food supply, and agribusiness, and environmental investigations they've done. And then on Sunday, we have Paul Lewis, who's going to be talking about using social media in investigations. So welcome. Well, I'm now a professor of journalism at City University, but also a freelance journalist. And I started off being a daily journalist in America covering crime, and before that I did politics. And when I came to Britain, I'm a dual British and American citizen, but I didn't know anybody. I came to London, I didn't know anyone, like not one person. And when I was thinking about being a journalist in London, I realized that it was a very closed shop, and it was very much a kind of incestuous little community there, where the way journalists seemed to get a lot of their information was from people that they knew. They'd gone to school with these people or university, went drinking with them, and it was all very informal networks of influence, I suppose. And I wasn't really used to doing that kind of journalism in that way. But the main problem was I didn't really know anybody. So I was trying to think, well, how can I practice journalism? And also I was a freelancer, so I wasn't working at any particular newspaper. I would just, eventually I was just selling to different newspapers. So I became interested in the Freedom of Information Act in Britain, because it's a way that somebody like me, who didn't know anything I didn't have any connections, I wasn't in the inner circle of British politics, I could start actually covering the very heart of politics without having to know people and without having to take them to lunch or to go drinking in the pub with them or any of those things. And that's really why I want to push to you the advantage of using the law is that when you use the law, you can be incredibly independent, because you don't have to be reliant on this sort of what can be a very tricky situation with sources, where they'll give you some information, but they expect something in return. So whether you're working as a parliamentary or a political reporter, you kind of hear these whispers, or one politician will tell you something. They're not doing that entirely altruistically. They generally have when the time comes, they'll want to kind of call in their favors and expect you to write an article in a certain way or make sure something gets in the newspaper or on the TV. And if you want to kind of avoid all that, then what you can do is you can use whatever statutes or legislation exist in your country to just make a request for information. So that's really the main advantage. It's good for not having to. It's good for those people like students or new journalists or young journalists or independent journalists. You don't have to kind of have these patronage networks, and it allows you to maintain your independence. So you feel that you can really write about whatever you want to without being compromised. So that's some information there. So that's my Twitter. If anybody wants to tweet, I'm at newsbrooke, and I have a website there, heatherbrooke.org. So, why do people want to use laws of access? I'm going to kind of talk about the different types of laws and things, but just to kind of get started, why would you use a law? And there are really kind of four or so main reasons that they're really useful and really effective and powerful. So the first one is corruption. I mean, I'm not saying anything about this particular politician, but if you have the law behind you, it's a really good way to investigate corruption. So you can you can make freedom of information requests for contracts, public publicly tendered contracts with a private company. You can ask about expenses that politicians have. You can ask about, so that was sort of the investigation that I was kind of most associated with was our British parliamentary expenses. So that all came from a Freedom of Information request asking parliamentarians, how do you spend your public allowance that you're given to have some kind of accommodation in London? And that exposed quite a lot of corruption. The other thing is fraud. So if people don't know, this is a Leonardo DiCaprio film, Catch Me If You Can, which is based on a fraudster. So, you probably, this is just an example, but for fraud, the main way you would use freedom of information or other kinds of access legislation like anti-bribery laws, anti-corruption laws, is to try and figure out who's getting money and where it's going. So you can request contracts, you can request correspondence between politicians and private companies, you can try and get spending information, budgets, you can try and get registers of interests. Another really good thing you can do is you can ask for registers of gifts and hospitality. So one investigation I did was around before the Olympics in London. I asked there was a government body called the Olympic Delivery Authority, and they were responsible for, kind of gearing up for the Olympics. And I asked them for their register of gifts and hospitality. And this was, this is meant to be quite forthcoming in all public bodies in Britain, and a lot of countries now are meant to have these and make them publicly available. And it lists all the gifts that the officials have received, what they were, what the kind of value is, and who they were given to. So I made that as a Freedom of Information request. They weren't initially very excited to give me that information, but eventually we agreed, and they said, well, it's too voluminous to give you a paper copy, and we don't have it as an electronic document. And I said, well, I will come and inspect the record then. So I came into the building and went upstairs, a very flash building in Canary Wharf, went up to the sort of top floor where the Olympic Delivery Authority is, and I was put into this tiny room, and they brought out these giant books, which are sort of like big notebooks, each about, 4 or 5 inches thick. And every page is a declaration by a public official of the gift they've received from an architecture firm, an accountancy firm, a law firm. And I mean, hundreds and hundreds of them, thousands of them. So it would be, they were invited to a wine reception, or they were given a box at Twickenham for the rugby match. And so you start to see who were the biggest benefactors to the Olympic Delivery Authority. And you probably won't be surprised to know it was construction firms, it was law firms who were sort of bidding to be the law firm that would write up all the contracts, architecture firms trying to make sure they were the architects that were chosen to build different venues. So once you have that, you can really start to see what are these kind of relationships and is there any kind of fraud going on. Health threats. So I picked this picture because it doesn't show any invasions of privacy. There's a little dummy there. But lots of health threats you can start to investigate using freedom of information. And there's a really strong public interest that overrides a lot of exemptions. So generally in every law, there are some exemptions, reasons why the person you're asking may not have to give you the information. There might be some privacy issues, maybe there's some commercial confidentiality, but in the case of health, the public interest in people being informed about health risks is so high that there's a very strong weight given to disclosing that information. And then, for me, really, my favorite thing is you can find out how things really work. not just how the government's telling you they work, not how the police department's saying, oh, we did everything by the book. We never mishandle people. We never lose evidence. We have an incredibly efficient, value for money, well-run system. Everybody's treated equally. I mean, that might be the rhetoric of how the sort of ideal world that they want the public to think how that organization is run. But when you start to make freedom of information requests, you can find out how things actually are run. So at the moment, I have a particular interest in propaganda, public relations. I feel like these public relations people, a lot of them are ex-journalists who can't find work anymore. So they've kind of jumped the fence, and now they work for private companies, and they're sort of peddling out all of this information, information spun in a way that makes the company look good. Okay, fine. But where I find this really problematic is increasingly you get a lot of public services who have very aggressive public relations strategies. And so I'm not sure what it's like in Italy, but in Britain, the police are very, very sensitive about how the public perceives them and how the public perceive their safety. So it's not enough for them to just solve crime, which you would think that's kind of a big enough job in itself, just dealing with crime, solving crime. But the police they really kind of seem to have an interest in micromanaging the public's perception of how they solve crime or how effective they are. And so in order to and if you talk to them, they say, no, we are fully open with the press and with the public. If there's incidents, then we tell you what they are. So one reporter who I met, he worked up in the north of England, and in Britain, the way the police tell the public what's happening is through the press, but they don't let the press kind of see every incident that's happened in the town. So if we were in Perugia, you couldn't just look up the incident log and see, there was a mugging, there was a stabbing, there was whatever. It would be up to the police to decide what they were going to tell the public. And in England, the way they do it is they pick out the most, what are meant to be the most sort of publicly important cases, and they put them on a voicemail system, and the reporters telephone and listen to these incidents. It's called a voice bank. So this reporter called up and this was meant to be all the incidents that had happened over a weekend in quite a busy and active city. And there was only 2 reported crimes that the police had put on this voice bank. And the reporter thought, I really can't believe, only 2 things of public interest have happened in the city for this entire weekend. It's just unbelievable. So he decided to make a freedom of information request and put it into the police department, saying, I want how many incidents happened over this 3-day period, and of those, can you say how many were serious violent crimes? So he made that request, and when he got the answer back, there was some 3,000 incidents that had happened, and of those, 80 were serious violent crimes, and yet there was only 2 put on this voice bank. So do you see what I mean? The police are trying to give the public an impression that everything is under control, we live in a totally safe city, you don't have to worry about anything. But in fact, they've taken it upon themselves to almost be journalists. They've decided what the public should know. They've decided, which crimes they're going to make available to people. And they're kind of taking over what I would say a lot of the journalist's role. And the only way you can kind of crack that facade is by using a law that gives you a right to know. So these are the kind of main types of access laws. We've got freedom of information is probably the main one, and a lot of places it's called Right to Information, or RTI. And about 90 countries, I'll show you a map in a minute, about 90 countries now have freedom of information law. And that deals generally with public information, so that would be government information. It's not a way for you to make a request to a private company like Capita or G4S or Serco. It's not about private companies. It's a right of a citizen, of a member of the public, to find out what their government is doing, supposedly in their name with their money. The second one is environmental access. So there's increasingly, and I think if you are really interested in environmental information, I would definitely recommend coming to the session tomorrow, because that's going to be all about accessing environmental information. And there's a real movement around the world to create these conventions on access to environmental information. So whether it's about pollution, the health of water, oceans, rivers, the air, the food supply, agriculture, the built environment, land, anything like that, there are now separate pieces of legislation which give the public a right to know. So, for example, in all of Europe, all the countries signed up to an agreement which is called the Aarhus Convention. It was agreed in Aarhus. So that's sort of been promulgated around the different EU countries. So in Britain, we have something called the Environmental Information Regulations, and that's the kind of British version of that European directive. But there will be one in Italy, there'll be one in France, Germany, every European EU country. Increasingly now, there's a lot of laws giving you access around finance, because we've seen, the collapse of banks and people wanting to know how did this happen. There's a lot, and the World Bank as well is trying to kind of push forward this idea of financial transparency. So whether that's having access to company registrations, whether it's a mandate that all companies have to file a disclosure. So, for example, in America, all companies that are registered on the stock exchange have to file a very detailed form with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so even if you're investigating a company in Europe or some other place, if they're listed on an American stock exchange, you can look up their information on the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Local governments. Most countries have laws that require local governments to give out to the public certain types of information. So whether it's a right to go to a public meeting that the local council has, there's a lot of laws around that. There's usually separate types of legislation around the public's ability to access budgets. So the council's budgets, their spending plans. In Britain, we have a right to see all the audit files, and that's a really powerful right under the Audit Commission Act, which allows a member of the public every 2 weeks of every year, they can go along to the council and you can look up all the receipts, every single receipt of a council, so every single thing they've ever spent money on, it's going to be audited by an accountant, and for 2 weeks in the year, which is very... It has to be advertised by law, but you find it in the smallest, tiniest print on the back page of the local newspaper, and they don't make it obvious at all. But there's this right to inspect the records that are going to go forward for the audit. Historical archives. A lot of times you can find information, even about current events, which because generally it's nothing new under the sun. Things have happened previously which have a bearing on today. And a lot of countries have records laws that require that information, once it's maybe 2 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old, has to go to a big archive, has to be archived centrally. So in Britain they have the National Archive, and things are collected there. and you can go and search through this giant repository. It's just like a huge library, and look up, whatever topic you're interested in. You can go to this archive and you can start investigating there. And then some information will be kept secret, but generally after a certain amount of time, it's all released. So what happens in UK is that after 30 years, all of the exemptions of classification fall away. And so you get these troops of reporters from all the newspapers who go along to the National Archives building, which is in West London, and they all sort of go there for the unveiling of all these documents which have been kept hidden for 30 years. And it's because in Britain, our security services are incredibly secretive. I mean, really, really secretive. And there's no public right to know about pretty much anything they do, which is very different from America, where in America, the security services are covered by the Federal Freedom of Information Act. So you can make requests to them. In Britain, they're totally exempt. I mean, they're exempt from pretty much every single disclosure law that there is. So it's really difficult to find out anything about MI5, MI6. And so the only way you can sometimes find information out about them is to go along to this National Archive and then wait for information to be released. Because even some of that intelligence material, after 30 years, it's considered no longer classified, and it's released. So you can start to piece together information from that. So there's a reporter in Britain who wrote a really interesting book called Cruel Britannia, and it's an investigation into the way Britain deals with interrogation techniques or torture. Was Britain complicit in extraordinary rendition? How did that develop? Did Britain ever torture people? And of course, if you go to any of these intelligence agencies, they're just going to tell you absolutely nothing at all. If you go to most politicians, they lie. I mean, that's what he found. They just outright lied. And so the only way he could do that story is he either had to find all the victims and sort of compare their stories. And if they were similar, he would sort of think, hey, well, these people don't know each other, but they're all telling me exactly the same thing that happened. And then he can use that. But the only other way he could get official documentation is he would go along to this National Archive, and he would find out, he would get historical documents. And personal information. So that's the other interesting thing to know about, is that in Europe, we all have a right to our own personal information. So we can make a data protection request. And it's not just to the government. It can be to any private company. So there's some really interesting examples. There was a German MEP who made a data protection request to his mobile phone company and said, I want to see everything that you're collecting on me, all the data that you hold about me. And they put him off for quite a long time, I think like almost a year, actually. And they're meant to respond within 40 days, but it just kept stretching and stretching. And then finally they responded, and he got 2 disks of information, and it was all the data of whenever his phone would check in to the mast. And so he worked with a reporter from a German newspaper, and they mapped out, they did a visualization of all that geodata, and it just showed a complete map of everywhere that MEP had been over the past year. I mean, like all very granular detail. And so if you think about that, it's there is no privacy anymore. But if you were interested in what does Facebook collect on me, what does my bank collect on me, and if you're investigating a story and you know the source very well, this is particularly good in health stories. If you are dealing with somebody who was a victim of some kind of I don't know, they were treated very badly in hospital, or one of their relatives died and you think it could have been prevented, then you can actually get the victim to help you in your investigation, because they can then, whereas if you tried to ask information from the hospital, they would probably say, no, sorry, but on privacy grounds, we can't tell you anything. But you can then ask the source to make what's called a subject access request under this Data Protection Act, and then they can start to extract all of the files, the health records, correspondence between the doctors, all of that stuff. They can then use that law to try and access that information. So here's just a few examples I've just put up here. This is a story in Canada. I'll just go through these quite quickly. But this is just to show you it's quite a global thing. It's not anything particular to Britain or America or whatever. So in Canada, they used a Freedom of Information request to, again, this sort of corruption. They found that they spent $250 million sponsoring a political organization. There's one in Ireland about a construction project, and again, if you go to any of the government spokespeople, they're not going to tell you that they've made an incredibly bad tender and terrible contract, with the politician's brother or something. They're never going to tell you that in a press release. They're going to tell you that under extreme duress, and the only kind of hammer you've got is the Freedom of Information Act. There's one in the Netherlands, which was about, they went to e-voting machines and there was concerns about them. And then there's one in Mexico about reports on murder and genocide, which had been collected, but they weren't being released, and they had to use access laws to get them released. So this is just a quick map, and if anybody wants these maps, yeah, if you want a copy of this map, it's available on Article 19. Yeah, article19.org. And this is just showing you the countries that, can we just get rid of this little picture of me on the side? Because it kind of, there we go. Yeah, so what this is showing you is that the dark countries have comprehensive national laws around freedom of information. The medium-colored country, the sort of light green, they have a law enacted. The light, so it should be the lightest one. I guess it might be, this current or recent initiative. And then the whites, there's no law. So this was true as of 2012. But there's always countries being added in. But again, so this is just giving you an idea, like where there's a law. But as with any law, what the law says and how it's actually practiced are two different things. So, if you look on here, you can see that Zimbabwe has a law, but actually it's not particularly effective at all. And you can see that Italy has a law, but, that's not very effective. And in fact, that's why people in Italy are trying to lobby to change it, make it more powerful, give people a greater right to access information. I think in Italy you have to justify why you want to access information. As if you paying all your taxes for a public service isn't enough reason to find out how it's being spent. You have to give more reasons, and generally that's not how those laws are meant to work. So again, this is a kind of more of a breakdown in Europe. We've got the green are national laws enacted, yellow were pending, pink, no law. So these are just, I'm going to just kind of whip through these quite quick because they're a bit heavy going. But these are some of the main pieces of legislation that you should know about if you're interested in finding out information. So in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, there's an Article 19, which is why that organization is called what it is, which is a right to seek information. There's a United Nations Convention on Corruption, Anti-Corruption, and there's also in the Convention on Human Rights Articles 8 and 10, which is also a right to information. Oops. And there's just a kind of roundup of the state of play. So yeah, I think it's actually almost 90 countries now that have rights of access. Oh yeah, 90 countries, 80 of them constitutional rights. You can see they do it a slightly different way in different places. But they do them slightly different, but generally they all have common common elements. And they give you a right to access. And it's not just a right to documents, but it's usually a right to information. So it's not just documents. It can be a right to data on a database that the government holds. It can be a right to videotape. So you could ask for CCTV footage. It could be for, or just plain old documents. There's usually several exemptions in there, but hopefully they're not very broad. And then they give you information about how to appeal. So if they reject you, they'll tell you, okay, if you're not happy with this, then you can appeal to the next level. And then there's usually some kind of oversight. Either it's an information commissioner or an ombudsman, and that's kind of the person that you appeal to. I'm going to skip that, I think. Yeah, so I'm just going to finish off with a story, and then we'll have some questions. So this is a picture of a bar, people talking in a bar. This was a story that I found really interesting because I was grading some papers of students. All the students at the city newspaper group have to do a Freedom of Information project. And they do it over 3 months because it takes, in Britain, they have, when you send in a Freedom of Information request, it takes 20 working days. The government body has 20 working days to respond. So they start in November, and they meet with me, and they talk about 2 ideas they have for an investigation that they want to make a Freedom of Information request about. And the whole exercise is kind of, they have to use this, this law. So one student came to me and he said, well, I did some work experience at a law firm last year, and when we were all out at the pub, some of the lawyers were talking about the fact that most of the people in England that are prosecuted for not having a television license are women. So in Britain we have to pay this TV license. So he kind of heard that and he thought, that's kind of weird. I wonder why women, I wonder if that's true, and B, why would women be kind of hit by it? And it's quite a big deal in Britain because it's a criminal offense. I mean, it seems unbelievable and totally ridiculous, but yeah, if you don't have like the proper license to watch a television, then you can you get a criminal record. If you're prosecuted and found guilty, you get a criminal record. So he heard this rumor and decided to investigate it. There's a women in prison. Is it true that women are disproportionately given a criminal record? And do they actually go to prison for not having a TV license? So the first thing he did was, so we talked about it, and I said, that sounds like a great story, which I must say is not how it always is with students. Sometimes they have these hugely broad things, and they haven't really narrowed it down very much. But I thought, that sounds like a really good story, but you need to find out, first of all, are those statistics already being kept? So he asked the Ministry of Justice, do you have statistics about people prosecuted for TV license evasion? And this was the answer. Computer says no, which is these very unhelpful officials in our Ministry of Justice said, our computer doesn't understand. No, we can't find that data for you. So he thought, okay, well, I'm going to make a Freedom of Information request for that data. Can you give me a list of all the people prosecuted and a breakdown by gender? And what was the outcome? Were they put in prison? Were they found guilty? Were they given a fine? Whatever. So he put in that request, and he then got back an answer. This is just, it was a bunch of data. So it wasn't the matrix, but it was a little spreadsheet which was a listing of all of the exactly that, all of the cases, the number of cases. Were they found guilty? Were they found innocent? If they were found guilty, were they given a fine? Were they given prison time? What happened to them? And what was the gender of that? And what he was able to do. So once he got that data, you can't end a journalism presentation without referring to, even if it's about TV license invasion. So he then got the information, and it showed exactly what his hunch was, that actually 2/3 of the people that were found guilty of TV evasion were women. So then what he has to do, because it's you can't just really get a story off that. I mean, that's one element of the story. It proved, how things really work. It is, in fact, the case that in Britain, 7 out of 10 people that are found guilty of TV license evasion are women. But then he has to get on the phone and really start investigating, well, why is that so? So he starts calling around different people. There's organizations about women in prison. And he gets some quotes from all those people, and then he writes up his story. And it was I thought it was a really good story, which he can then pitch to a newspaper. So I'm going to end there, and then we've got about 10 or so minutes, 10, 15 minutes for questions. So, thanks. Yes. Do we have a mic or no? I think it's because the people in the translation booth can't hear you. So here's a mic.
Okay.
And if you're just speaking Italian, then let me know so I can...
Sasa.
Are you speaking Italian?
I'm going to speak in English or whatever.
I'll try to understand, you know.
Okay. No, just two quick questions. One about the fact you mentioned in Germany, whether a citizen has the right to ask for them to cancel their data that they collect on them. And the second one, if there is in the UK like an independent body that oversees on the genuinity of the data that you're provided with once you apply for a Freedom of Information Act, whether there's a chance that maybe corrupted politician or bureaucrat pollutes the data.
Yes, okay, so for the first question about the mobile phone data, there's a big movement in Europe right now about people's rights to control personal information about themselves. Does a company have a right to just, like Google or any, they're just like harvesting all of this massive amounts of data about people. And how can that be controlled, and do we have any right over it? And we do have some rights over it, but in that case, I don't know what he ended up doing with it. I mean, I think he made a campaign of it because he said, look, this is outrageous. What business does this mobile phone company have to, keep geotagging me every 2 seconds across, it's total invasion of privacy. So, but at the moment there isn't really a lot being done about it, because it's just a new problem that is kind of coming into people's consciousness. And in the European Union, they're now debating redrafting the the Data Protection Directive. So, and those issues are being discussed. On the second one, how do you know they're not lying to you in the data in the response they give you? Well, it's in most laws, it's a criminal offense to alter or manipulate data that's subject to a request. But when I did the MPs expenses investigation, there was two other reporters who were joined into my case, and one of them had asked for Tony Blair's expenses for a particular year when he took out, it was a kind of weird mortgage situation, and it was always a bit dodgy, like it was not quite clear how much it was, and did the taxpayer pay for it, or what was going on. And when we were in the tribunal, it came out that all of that information had been destroyed. Shredded, and shredded after it had been subject to a request, which is a criminal offense. So technically, whoever was in charge of whoever made the decision to shred all that material should have been dealt with. But in fact, the reality was that they weren't, because the civil servant said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. We had a new person in the office who didn't quite understand our records management policies, and they were over-officious, and they just decided to, deal with our archives in a more efficient manner than they were supposed to." And then it was forgotten about. So there's quite a few instances where I guess the danger is if they do lie or change the material, and it's shown that that's happened, it's a huge reputational risk that they take by doing that. Yes.
Hi there. I wanted to ask you about what you felt about the future sustainability of freedom of information law. As people become increasingly empowered to use it and journalists use it as a route to get information, it becomes more and more expensive to keep the law enacted fairly. I know a lot of the main public bodies now do have an information officer within them, and that's becoming more and more the case. And I wondered if you felt that, as an example I thought of, I live in Hackney in London, and there's quite a funny freedom of information request where one guy has made like 20 information requests in the space of 2 months. And then somebody else has made an information request asking about the cost of all his information requests. And it was thousands and thousands of pounds.
According to the official.
Well, yeah. So I wondered if you thought that freedom of information law is sustainable for the future, or if there's an alternative, like a process of revealing information.
Okay,
that would be
so
better.
are these laws value for money, or are they just a waste of money? Well, this idea that they're too expensive is always put forward by officials when they don't want to have a law. So, for example, the Isle of Man, which is this small island off the coast of Britain, and is also an offshore tax haven. There's a big move there to try and get a freedom of information law, and all of the government officials, they're saying no, we don't want it, and their main argument is they say it would be too expensive. We don't have the resources to cover it. Well, it's my opinion that this is a totally bogus argument, but I'll tell you a few reasons why. First of all of this information, we're talking about information that was collected at taxpayer expense for the benefit of the public. Why do we then feel like why do we feel like we don't have a right to see that? You know, it was collected for us, with our money. So it should really be to us that they are ultimately accountable. Like, their priority should be to account to us for what they're up to. Also, it's probably the most efficient way to expose waste and corruption and fraud. So there was I could catalog a huge amount of stories where just ridiculous amounts of waste have been exposed simply by asking a freedom of information request. Somebody made one to Parliament, unless you I guess if you're there all the time, you would have noticed this, but there are these little trees in boxes. They're not actually that little. They're quite big trees. And they're in the kind of atrium of the new section of Parliament in Portcullis House. And somebody made a freedom of information request for the cost of these trees, the initial cost and the maintenance of them. And it was huge. It was like £12 million a year for these. I mean, I'm just making that up, but it was absolutely colossal. And there were like 12 trees. And somebody had just signed a contract without really thinking about it, for this huge amount of money, because they felt like nobody was looking at them and it wasn't their money, so what did they care? And that's really the attitude. It's like, if it's not your money and nobody's looking at you, it's so easy to misspend money, or, to put it in your pocket, put it in your friend's pocket, put it in your family member's pocket. And so if you you can have as many regulators in the world as you want, but those regulators can all be captured by exactly the same interests that started the corruption in the first place. But the only really place that can be corrupted is the whole public, because there's too many of us, to capture. And so that's why, accountability, freedom of information is so good, because it's sort of it's crowdsourcing the whole public domain to keep an eye on officials. Yes. How many other questions are there, just out of curiosity? Okay, yes.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now. I'm surprised by the map you showed, because Spain appears in green and we don't have a freedom of information law. So I don't know why it's there. I would love to know the rationale. But Spain is one of the few countries in Europe that doesn't have a freedom of information law. We're about to get one now. So I would like to brainstorm with you. We have 1 month. The bill is in Congress. It's a very weak law. It doesn't affect all the public institutions. The agency that will oversee the implementation of the law, or that the law is actually applied, is not independent. It's not recognized. Freedom of information is not recognized as a fundamental right. And there are some other problems, but those are the main ones. And the law is being discussed. Experts are being listened to, but just listened to. They don't make questions. Politicians don't make notes.
Yeah.
And it's going to be passed, approved in 1 month or so. And right now we only have the, I don't remember, politicians can make amendments, right? So if you were in the same situation, knowing as much as you know about freedom of information, kind of like on a deadline, because they're going to pass a law that it's pretty much shit, what would you do?
Well, the British law is also a bit shit, to be honest with you. I mean, I would say it's like really shit, actually. And the way I dealt with it is that if you create a big enough scandal, then it has to work. Then there becomes a public mood. I mean, if we go back to this again, freedom of information in America was always okay, but it wasn't that strong, and there was quite a lot of really big exemptions. Well, then you had Watergate, and like instantly everyone was like, oh my God, these corrupt politicians, how can we better hold them to account? And immediately all of the freedom of information laws were massively beefed up. So I guess if you're going to say, what's my advice on a deadline, is like just uncover a gigantic scandal. And then, then you kind of move the public into a different space. Because that's particularly what happened in Britain, is that people were I found it quite strange coming from America, but British people are quite deferential towards authority. They really took everything they said at face value, I thought. And particularly, they just had no thinking that their politicians could be corrupt at all. Like, no, not really at all. And so when I was doing this investigation, I just thought, well, why would you even be doing that? I mean, we have right honorable gentlemen as our politicians. And, we're not like those other countries where they're all corrupt, like Berlusconi. No. And then, in fact, you found out that there was a lot of really incredibly shady things going on, with building up property empires at taxpayer expense and everything else. But once that was exposed, which I'm not trying to degrade it was a really big and very resource-intensive investigation that took 5 years. But once it was exposed, it totally changed the culture about how people viewed those in power. And I think in terms of people feeling like they had a right to know, they definitely, I felt there was a culture shift there where people felt much more empowered to hold politicians to account. Anyway, yes. One more question and then I'll close.
I just wanted to pick you up on that last point. Do you think that that's happening? I mean, do you think that following the MPs' expenses scandal, there is an increase in people actually wanting to act as watchdogs and monitor what MPs are doing in other ways? Or do you think it's sort of backfired and now there is a huge apathy and everyone is making very vague assumptions that all politicians are stealing from the public funds anyway, so it would actually turn them off politics rather than get them more inspired to change it?
Right. Well, I mean, cynicism is as bad as naivety, really. It's lazy thinking, and there is this worry that, because politicians were found to have been, corrupt and guilty of fraud in several cases, that they're all a bunch of crooks. Well, they're not. There's a lot of politicians who are perfectly decent. And the problem, if you think they're all crooks, is that then nobody, what's the incentive for the people doing good to carry on doing good? So I guess I would say that we have to be more involved. I mean, we do. I think it is a truism that we get the politicians we deserve. And if we can't be bothered to hold them to account, well, why not put that money in their pocket? Why shouldn't they? It's really kind of the onus is on us, and I don't just mean as journalists, I mean as citizens, that if we don't want to have corrupt politicians, we have to expend at least the minimal amount of energy to read a newspaper or to find out what's happening and to demand better behavior. Well, anyway. So I hope that if you've not used one of these laws in your past, that you'll think about that for the future and feel more comfortable to do it. It's not difficult. You can be a totally new journalist. You can be an experienced journalist. But yeah, if you really want to know what's going on, then I hope you give it a go. Thank you.